not only in obviously Syria, obviously Yemen and so on, but in Wisconsin. What they did in Wisconsin was, in reaction to what they saw people had done in Egypt, the teachers who didn't like the new union law that would draw union recognition from them in Wisconsin were in a place where all strikes by teachers are illegal. So their union, knowing it would be illegal to strike, instructed all of the teachers in Wisconsin to become sick. So all the teachers in Wisconsin became sick on the same day. Couldn't go into work, but were luckily still well enough to go down and occupy the state capitol building. And the teenagers in the high schools, noticing that they had no teachers, and checking Facebook to find out where the teachers had gone, followed them. This was something quite new in America. Not just new for 40 years, this was something new in America. It was a way of trying to figure out how to do what they did in Egypt. And you can see that, you can see the same thing in Spain. It appears to not be working, but it's very large. And they're trying to see what they did in Egypt, what bits of it can we do, how we do it. What we are beginning to see now is people moving. And people moving in very large numbers. And people are moving in very large numbers because life is hard. All of these upheavals started, you gotta remember, with a vegetable seller in an arid part of Tunisia, in a market, who in an area of Tunisia affected by climate change, in the middle of mass unemployment, where he just couldn't bear what the police were doing to him for the umpteenth time. So he burned himself to death in front of the police station. And that's not what started it. What started it was the women in his family then invaded the police station, taking the rest of the people from the market with them. But to understand what was happening in that market to that vegetable seller, you have to understand mass unemployment, and you have to understand what's happening to food because of climate change. It's working its way through. It's working its way through, and now we're coming to a time where it may be possible for people again to imagine solving the large problems, solving them together by creating governments that are going to solve them. I'll end there, except to say two things. One is where I started with writing the book. For this to happen, for us to have the solution, it's no good if we have some people talking about climate change over here and a mass movement over here. What we need is the ideas of climate, that we can do something about climate change, and that to do something about climate change in this country means 1 million new jobs in this country. Globally, it means about 100 million new jobs. We have to put that idea in the middle of this new movement that is creating itself. And the other thing is, which I haven't covered at all, but is at length in the book and matters, is if we don't do this, we face abrupt climate change. We face very widespread famine. We face hundreds of millions of refugees. And we face war. Because if you change the balance of economic and power, change where the water is in the world, countries will go to war to restore that balance. All of these things, we face all of these things happening together. This is not abstract. If you want to see what this looks like, look at Darfur and at Chad, where there's been a climate change drought for 40 years, and where you can see there war, famine, refugees going together. That's what we face. Not face the end of, nobody knows for sure, but we face the end of about 30% of the species on Earth. And humanity will survive, but hundreds of millions will die. It will be worse than the worst tragedy of the 20th century, which was the Second World War. That's what we face if we don't do something about it. because that's what we face, and because actually on some level most people are starting to know that, there is a possibility that we will be able to stop it. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Well, we've got about 35 minutes, questions.
And on to the pub. Come on to the pub.
Yeah, and a trip to the pub.
Yeah, first of all, I'm glad you're talking about people being on the move, because as we all know, Rosa Luxemburg said, you know, if you don't move, you're not aware of your chains. Now, I went to a talk over the weekend about Colombia, La Colosa gold mine. And Colombia is a country with the greatest biodiversity in the world. And there was a speaker, Alexandra Martinez, who was talking about what we would lose if it were 2 degrees warmer, and it's quite horrifying. And then he talked about what would happen if it were 4 degrees warmer. Now, I like to think I am in tune about what happens in the world, but I was not aware, you know, that there would be so many losses. As to Marxism saving the world, let's hope so. I've got to say, when we heard about, everybody at this meeting was a Marxist, but I think if they hadn't been, after hearing what could happen to the biodiversity, to animals and to humanity, and it also brought home the evils of capitalism. All the people, this is a company called Anglo Gold Ashanti, and all they were interested in was gold, money. Didn't matter if people got injured, didn't matter that areas were being totally destroyed, areas becoming polluted. So they particularly, when I told them I was coming here tonight, they particularly wanted to sort of bring this to people's notice about how quickly what can only be considered a slight temperature rise could utterly devastate an area. So I thought I'd bring this to your notice.
Yes, you said that we need a lot of solar and a lot of wind power. Surely around the British Isles there's lots of tidal water energy that could be utilised?
Do I wait
Yeah,
till
do
the second?
you want to come back
Okay.
individually?
Yeah, it's mainly, on a global scale, it's mainly solar and wind. You also need tidal power, you need wave power, you need sun hydro power, you need geothermal. You need all of these things because you're having to, the wind sometimes blows harder than it blows other times. The sun doesn't shine at night. And you get around that variability by linking up electricity over very long distances. So if the wind isn't blowing in the Orkneys, it's blowing off Cornwall. And so on. What both tidal power and wave power, which is a different thing, are very important in that because they're really very predictable and regular, but they won't do as much. The stuff I've been reading about people who count them, it is globally it's solar and wind are the key ones. In and around the British Isles, it's wind because we have the enormous wind resources of the North Sea, really. And our sun's not as good. On Colombia, there's one thing I didn't emphasize here that I would if I was doing the talk in Colombia is the importance of preserving the tropical rainforests, the old rainforests. They make about 15% of the difference for all greenhouse gases comes at the moment from basically destruction of forests, and most of that the tropical rainforests are the most important because they're so much denser in biomass than the northern forests. So they're the key thing, and sustainable forestry won't do it because you're constantly cutting the trees down and destroying the undergrowth. What you need is to preserve the forest forever. So in Brazil or Indonesia or Colombia, that's a key part of the politics of climate change. Much less so here.
Brian at the back.
Jonathan, I have to say that I'm very unhappy with your model of what one might describe in extremis as the benign capitalist. You did say that capitalists aren't there
Yes.
to destroy the world, aren't set
Yeah.
out to destroy the world, and I believe you're dead right there. But I think if you climb into what we might call the capitalist model, and particularly the capitalist corporation model, I would contend that it's to a large extent driven by psychopaths. Essentially, they're not out to destroy the world, but basically they don't give a monkeys. As long as they're keeping their shareholders happy, as long as they're rising up to being the next chief executive, as long as the profits keep rolling in. Example, the Arctic ice is beginning to disappear. What do the bloody vultures and jackals do? Not think, oh my God, this is the biggest wake-up call we've had. They're flying in. They're now seeking to make more profits. So they're not benign, they are evil buggers, not by their intent to be evil, but by the way they work and their own psychology.
Can I throw a question?
Yeah.
You were talking as a Marxist about how the working class are the most powerful and the huge kind of group of people to take on board, and I was reading just this morning about how you combine social justice and climate justice, and how if you divide those things we've got no chance. But isn't it true that just as, say, the capitalists that Brian was talking about can protect themselves in kind of wealth and air conditioning, and they've got the money, and it's always the poorest of the world who get hit hardest by climate change, isn't it true that maybe in the developed countries large sections of the working class will be relatively protected from the full impact of things like climate change and may not kind of move? I mean, you've given the Wisconsin teachers as a fantastic example, but there are also people who are keeping their head down. They don't want to rock the boat. They're going to lose their job. And I kind of agree with you in my heart, but I worry in my head that there'll be people who the working class may not move together. And I agree with your analysis essentially, but I'm worried that people might have the difference between if you've got a job and you haven't got a job is massive, isn't it? In this country, and then if you think about that in Africa and France and Britain and everywhere, I just worry about the Marxist model. Will it fit this? And this is like a new problem for the world, like we've never had before, isn't it? And I'm not sure whether some of the old models fit.
Jonathan said it's really complicated, and I think it is. But I think if you look at the arguments that are put forward in that 1 Million Climate Jobs pamphlet, and if we can do what we've been trying to do and to get that taken up by trade unions, if you turn to people, I heard the other day that just from one primary school around here, 15 families have lost their homes because they can't afford it. The housing crisis is getting worse and worse. In solving the housing crisis, we need people building more homes, we need more family homes being built, but we also need those homes to be sustainable. We need them built with climate change in mind. We do need to get those arguments in, and it's not going to happen all at once. But if you look at the occupation at the Vestas plant on the Isle of Wight, though it was really significant that those workers who weren't in a union went on strike, but did join the union. But not only were they worried about the loss of their jobs, and not only were other people on the Isle of Wight really worried about what more unemployment was going to do, they were really proud of the jobs they were doing because of the effect of the environment. And I think that that's something that can be built on. Now, I'm quite terrified that it can't be built on within the time scale that exists. I think it's really difficult. And I think that I think one thing that is very significant is that children from, well, I was taking my grandson out in the park the other day, and he's really worried about global warming, came back, he was crying, and I didn't know why. It was because he desperately wanted to watch television, but he didn't want to add to the possible damage to the planet. Now, this is how a 6-year-old sees the world, and it worries me that too much pressure is put, as you're saying, in terms of denial, in terms of conscience. I mean, we solved it by saying he could be the person who took on the job of reminding everybody else in the household to turn the lights off when they weren't being used. And luckily that solved it. But too much of the climate change movement is about looking at the most personal solutions. We then have to push it out to undermining the spirit of competition and looking at the spirit of cooperation and what really could be done. But also saying, look, I did an online shop in Tesco's the other day. I haven't done that for quite a long while. And really noticeable how much prices have gone up. That's just here. Prices in Egypt, food prices have gone up 30% in 6 months. That is really going to propel people, and it's again quite like Rosa Luxemburg again, socialism or barbarism. You know, one or other will have to be the solution. But we do it in the time.
Do you want to come back on any of these, or
Your judgment. I'm
yeah?
trying to
Do
come
you
back
want
on.
to come back on these, and then we'll take some more questions after?
I think it's better if you come back after each one, because
Yeah, let's do.
otherwise
Yes,
someone might
because
ask the same
we-
question.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's-
Thank you.
Okay. The benign capitalists.
An oxymoron.
I agree with you. I agree with you that it's what they're pushed into. And in a sense, often the most unpleasant people in it are middle management or the owners of small businesses. Because they're the people who are right up against it, having to push. Whereas if you sit in the CEO's office, you can be in some sense the sociopath, but you can actually be quite nice to your family and so on, and just pretend that those people out there aren't people. The hardest thing of all is when you're the face-to-face manager